Imagine a scenario that, well, it sounds like the plot of a political thriller.
Oh, absolutely.
You have a former president of the United States, and they've served 2 full, exhausting terms in the Oval Office, so they are constitutionally barred from ever running for that top job again.
Right, the classic 2-term limit.
Exactly.
Okay.
So the American public assumes this leader has permanently retired, right? They're going to go write memoirs, maybe build a presidential library.
Usually how it goes.
Yeah, but instead they find a back door. They decide to run as the vice presidential candidate on a brand new ticket, and the ticket wins.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. And then, shortly after Inauguration Day, the new president resigns. Suddenly, the person we all thought was legally banned from the presidency is sitting right back behind the Resolute desk.
Well, I mean, the immediate assumption for most people is that such a maneuver has to be illegal.
Right.
Because, we are taught in grade school that the Constitution has this strict 2-term limit. You serve your time and you're out.
Yeah, 2 and done.
Exactly. But when you actually strip away the conventional wisdom and analyze the precise comma-by-comma text of the Constitution, that back door might actually be wide open.
Which is just crazy. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission today is to completely decode the 22nd Amendment of the U.S. Constitution.
Yeah, it's a law most of us think we understand completely.
We really do.
Yeah.
But the actual text, the historical circumstances that forced it into existence, and the wild, unresolved legal loopholes it creates are incredibly complex.
Very much so.
So we're taking a dense area of constitutional law and translating it into the ultimate cheat sheet for you.
Right.
Whether you are catching up on political science, prepping for a civics discussion, or you're simply a working professional who is just insanely curious about how the machinery of American government actually functions, this is for you.
And to guide us through this machinery, we are pulling from a really fascinating stack of sources today.
We've got some great stuff.
Yeah, we have foundational historical records provided by the National Constitution Center. We're also examining exhaustive state-by-state legislative histories of the amendment's ratification. Those were compiled by Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, or CRW.
Right.
And finally, we are going to navigate that political thriller scenario you mentioned using a comprehensive legal analysis by constitutional scholar Dan T. Conan.
Oh, that piece is so good.
It really is. It's appropriately titled Two-Time Presidents and the Vice Presidents.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we look at the exact wording of the 22nd Amendment, we have to understand the environment that made it necessary in the first place.
Right, the context.
Exactly. In everyday life, whether you're managing a household or, running a corporate department, formal rules usually aren't written down until an unspoken, unwritten rule gets drastically broken.
That is so true. And to find the origin of that unwritten rule, we actually have to travel all the way back to the Constitutional Convention of 1787 in Philadelphia.
Oh, wow, way back.
Yeah, when the framers were designing the executive branch, the question of how long a president should serve was hotly debated.
I can imagine.
It was not a foregone conclusion that we would even have term limits, let alone a 4-year term. I mean, Alexander Hamilton, for instance, famously argued for a president who would serve during good behavior.
Wait, good behavior? That's essentially lifetime tenure, isn't it?
It is. It was basically lifetime tenure. He wanted the stability of the British system, just minus the hereditary monarchy part.
I mean, lifetime tenure feels dangerously close to the exact kind of king they had just fought a brutal, multi-year revolutionary war to escape.
Right.
I can imagine that proposal did not go over well with the entire room.
It definitely did not. It was met with fierce opposition, most notably from George Mason of Virginia.
Okay.
Mason vehemently denounced the idea of lifetime tenure. He warned that it would inevitably degrade into an elective monarchy.
Elective monarchy, that's a great phrase.
Yeah, he argued that human nature, being what it is, any person handed executive power for life would just eventually surround themselves with sycophants and rule like a dictator.
Makes sense.
The framers were terrified of entrenched power. And because of this fear, they entertained several different models.
Like what?
Well, an early draft of the Constitution actually proposed that the president be restricted to a single 7-year term.
Wait, really? Just one 7-year term?
Yep. You get one shot, 7 years to execute your agenda, and then you are permanently retired.
A single 7-year term is a fascinating historical what if.
It really is.
Because you wouldn't have the constant pressure of re-election campaigns dominating the first term. Right. Which is something we see constantly today.
Oh, constantly.
Presidents wouldn't have to spend their third and fourth years fundraising, they could just govern.
And that was the exact argument for the single term. But the counter-argument won out.
What was the counter-argument?
Basically, if a leader is doing an exceptional job, particularly during a national crisis, the country shouldn't be forced to fire them just because the timer went off.
Okay, yeah, that's a fair point.
So they ultimately compromised. They established a 4-year term, but they left the Constitution completely silent on how many times a person could be elected.
So they just left it blank.
Yep. The door was left wide open for a president to serve for decades if the voters kept choosing them.
Which brings us to George Washington.
Yes, exactly.
He wins the first election, serves his 4 years, wins the second election, and serves another 4. By 1796, he's still widely popular.
Incredibly popular.
He could have easily won a third term, but he voluntarily steps away. He publishes his farewell address and goes back to Mount Vernon.
And Washington's decision was monumental. He recognized that as the first president, literally everything he did set a precedent.
Right.
By walking away from power when he didn't have to, he proved that the presidency was an office of public service, not a lifelong entitlement.
That's a huge distinction.
It is. And Thomas Jefferson, our third president, followed that exact same pattern and actively codified the philosophy behind it. Well, Jefferson argued forcefully that without a clear, voluntary limit, the office could easily become a lifelong inheritance. He believed that regular turnover in the executive branch was essential to prevent a political class from permanently entrenching itself.
So that voluntary choice by Washington, philosophically backed by Jefferson, created a really powerful tradition.
Yeah, a massive tradition.
It became an unwritten rule that governed American politics for over a century and a half. No president, no matter how popular, served more than 2 terms.
Right.
I mean, Ulysses S. Grant flirted with a third term. Theodore Roosevelt actually ran for a non-consecutive third term and lost. But the 2-term limit held firm.
It held firm until the world caught fire.
Literally.
Literally. The person who finally shattered Washington's unwritten rule was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He won the presidency in 1932 during the absolute nadir of the Great Depression.
Yeah.
He won re-election in 1936. By the time the 1940 election rolled around, Washington's 2-term tradition dictated that FDR should step down.
The timing was terrible.
Exactly. Europe was engulfed in World War II, and the United States was teetering on the edge of entering the conflict.
So FDR argued that stepping down in 1940, and again in 1944, would be dangerously irresponsible.
He did.
He made the case to the American people that you do not change the commander-in-chief in the middle of an unprecedented global crisis. And the voters agreed with him. They elected him to a 3rd term and then a 4th.
Right, and it is really important to know how controversial this was at the time, even within his own party.
I bet.
Breaking a 150-year-old tradition shocked the political establishment. But FDR's sheer political gravity, combined with the existential threat of the Axis powers, allowed him to override the unwritten rule.
But then FDR died in April 1945, just months into his 4th term.
Yes.
And almost immediately after his death, the political backlash began.
It started very quickly.
Now, real quick, before we discuss that backlash, I want to establish some parameters for our discussion. To understand the legal mechanics of the 22nd Amendment, we have to look at how it interacts with several modern presidents. The source material covers figures from FDR and Harry Truman to Barack Obama and Donald Trump.
Right, a wide range.
So, as we navigate this, I want to be clear to you listening that we are looking purely at the constitutional machinery. We are taking absolutely no political sides and endorsing no political agendas.
Exactly.
We are impartially analyzing how the legal system processes challenges involving these figures based strictly on the historical and legal records provided.
And that objective lens is essential, especially when looking at the immediate aftermath of FDR's presidency.
Okay, so take us there.
In the 1946 midterm elections, the Republican Party gained control of both the House and the Senate for the first time since FDR had taken office in 1932.
Wow, so over a decade.
Right. They had been shut out of executive power for a long time, and they moved swiftly to ensure no single person could ever hold the presidency for that long again. In 1947, this Republican-controlled Congress drafted what would become the 22nd Amendment.
Now, a cynic might look at that and say, well, that's just partisan revenge, right? The Republicans couldn't beat FDR at the ballot box, so they changed the rules of the game after he died.
Sure, people said that.
But the sources show that the support for this amendment was not purely partisan.
No, it wasn't. It was overwhelmingly driven by Republicans, yes, but it tapped into a much deeper bipartisan anxiety.
Really?
Yeah. In the Senate, the measure was supported by a unanimous Republican caucus, but they were also joined by 9 Democrats.
Oh, interesting.
Historians point out that FDR's 4 terms reawakened the ghost of George Mason. There was a genuine fear of the indispensable man, which is that dangerous psychological trap where a nation becomes convinced that only one specific leader can solve their problems.
That's a great way to put it, the indispensable man.
Yeah. As one prominent editorial from the era articulated, the amendment was born of a fear that the republic itself could be endangered by the presence of any one man too long in the office of the chief executive.
So the goal was to protect the structural integrity of the democracy from the charisma of any single individual.
Exactly.
You know, I always think of this transition from an unwritten tradition to a formal law, like a workplace dynamic.
How so?
Well, imagine a company has an unspoken honor system for the office supply closet.
Okay, I'm with you.
It works perfectly for 30 years. People take a notepad or a pen when they need it, and everyone respects the boundary.
Right.
But then one ambitious employee decides to take home 3 laser printers, 2 office chairs, and a case of toner.
That'll do it.
Suddenly, HR realizes the honor system isn't enough anymore. They have to step in and write a formal, rigid policy with exact constraints.
That perfectly captures the shift. Congress realized they could no longer rely on the ghost of George Washington to enforce the 2-term limit. They had to write the code.
Right.
But writing a constitutional amendment is an incredibly difficult exercise in anticipating edge cases. You have to account for every possible weird scenario.
Because it's permanent.
Exactly. And the most complex bug they had to fix in this new legal code was the issue of succession.
Because you can't just write a 1-sentence law that says 2 terms and you are done.
No, you can't.
I mean, a term might not be a full 4 years. What happens if a president dies in office or resigns and the vice president has to suddenly inherit the role?
Exactly. The drafters had to create a mathematical formula that was fair to a succeeding vice president while still maintaining the spirit of the term limit.
So how did they word it?
So, Section 1 of the 22nd Amendment opens with the baseline rule. No person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice.
Okay, that closes the front door for anyone trying for a 3rd term.
Yes. But then it immediately addresses the succession issue.
Let's break down the exact text of that succession math, because this is where the amendment gets surprisingly granular.
It really does. The text states that no person who has held the office of president or acted as president for more than 2 years of a term to which some other person was elected president shall be elected to the office of the president more than once.
Okay, let's translate that into everyday terms, maybe using a timeline.
Good idea.
For a listener who manages complex schedules or project timelines at work, this is a very strict amortization schedule.
It is.
A standard presidential term is exactly 4 years, which we can calculate as 1,460 days. The amendment uses a hard dividing line of exactly 2 years.
Right. The halfway point of the predecessor's term is the constitutional tripwire.
Okay.
If you are the vice president and you inherit the presidency in the first half of your predecessor's term, meaning you serve more than 2 years of their unexpired term, the Constitution considers that a massive chunk of time.
You've essentially served a full term in the eyes of the law.
Exactly. Therefore, you are only permitted to run for election in your own right one single time.
So, if I get the top job on day 729 of my predecessor's term, I am serving more than 2 years.
Right.
I get to finish that term, and then I can only run for one more 4-year term.
Yeah.
My maximum possible time in office would be just under 8 years.
Correct. But let's look at the other side of the tripwire.
Okay.
If you inherit the presidency in the second half of your predecessor's term, meaning you take over on day 731, and you serve 2 years or less of their unexpired term, the law gives you a break.
A break.
Yeah, you are legally permitted to run for 2 full 4-year terms of your own.
Which leads to a fascinating piece of constitutional trivia. Under the strict math of the 22nd Amendment, what is the absolute maximum number of days a single human being can serve as president of the United States?
10 years.
10 years.
Yep. If a vice president takes over exactly at the 2-year mark of their predecessor's term, serves out those 2 years, and then wins 2 consecutive 4-year elections, they will have served exactly 10 years.
That's amazing.
Yeah, 10 years is the absolute constitutional ceiling for continuous executive service. It is a brilliant mathematical compromise.
It really is.
Yeah.
It prevents a 10-plus year dynasty, but it doesn't overly penalize a vice president who is forced to step up late in an administration.
Exactly.
But You know, the drafters of the amendment included a very specific exception in the text, didn't they? A grandfather clause that applied to only one person.
Yes, they did. The text explicitly states that the new rules would not apply to the person holding the office of president when the amendment was proposed by Congress.
And who was that?
In March of 1947, that person was Harry S. Truman. Truman had been FDR's vice president, and he took over when FDR died in 1945, very early in FDR's fourth term.
Right. So under the new math we just discussed, Truman would have been serving more than 2 years of FDR's unexpired term.
He was.
So normally he would only be allowed to run for election once, which he did in 1948.
Right. Without the grandfather clause, Truman would have been legally barred from running again in 1952. But Congress recognized the inherent unfairness of changing the rules of the game while the current player was already on the field.
That makes sense.
So they exempted him. Legally, Harry Truman could have run for another term in 1952.
But he didn't.
No. Deeply unpopular at the time due to the Korean War, Truman chose to honor the spirit of the new law and Washington's old tradition. He voluntarily chose not to run, retiring from office in 1953.
Okay, so Congress writes the code, they establish the 10-year ceiling, and they carve out the Truman exemption. They passed the resolution in Washington, D.C. in March 1947.
Yes.
But a congressional resolution is just a piece of paper. To change the Constitution, you have to get the entire country to agree.
And it is an intentionally grueling process. Article V of the Constitution requires that any amendment be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures.
3/4?
Yeah. In 1947, there were 48 states in the Union, meaning they needed exactly 36 states to say yes, and Congress didn't give them unlimited time. No, they attached a strict 7-year sunset clause. If the proponents couldn't get 36 states to ratify the amendment within 7 years, it would automatically die.
This is where the historical documents compiled by CUW become so valuable.
They're amazing.
They provide a state-by-state legislative history that reads like a political drama. It wasn't just a rubber stamping process.
Not at all.
The debates happening in these state capitals show an entire nation grappling with the fundamental nature of executive power. And the race to 36 states started incredibly fast, right?
It did. On March 31st, 1947, just days after Congress submitted the amendment to the states, Maine and Michigan became the first 2 states to ratify it.
Wow, that is fast.
They acted with overwhelming speed. In Maine, the Republican supermajority pushed it through with virtually no debate.
They were right.
The sentiment was captured by one representative who bluntly stated on the floor, "I think we are too late. It should have happened long ago."
The implication, of course, being that they wish they could have applied it to FDR.
Exactly.
But as the amendment moved out of the Northeast and into the Midwest and South, it hit significant friction. It wasn't a smooth Republican steamroller everywhere.
Definitely not.
The CRW sources highlight a massive philosophical clash in the North Dakota Senate in early 1949.
North Dakota is a perfect microcosm of the national debate. You had lawmakers openly questioning whether term limits were actually anti-democratic.
Which is an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, a Democratic state senator named Harry O'Brien took the floor and called the amendment shameful.
Shameful? Why?
His argument was deeply pragmatic. He told his colleagues that limiting a president to 2 terms restricts the voters' freedom of choice during times of immense crisis.
Okay, I see.
He warned them not to vote based on their feelings about FDR or Herbert Hoover, but to imagine a hypothetical crisis 50 years in the future.
Right.
If the nation found a capable leader during a war or a depression, why should the Constitution force the voters to fire them?
That is a powerful argument. It essentially asks, who are we to tell our grandchildren who they are allowed to vote for?
Yes.
But the counter-argument in North Dakota was equally forceful.
It was. The opposition was championed by Senator R.M. Stribel, who represented a faction known as the Nonpartisan League.
What was his stance?
Stribel argued that without a structural constitutional limit, a U.S. president might easily perpetuate himself in office indefinitely. He argued that the power of the modern presidency had grown so massive that an incumbent held an almost insurmountable advantage.
It's true. Incumbency is huge.
Yeah, it was a direct clash between 2 democratic ideals. Trusting the wisdom of the voters to make the right choice in an emergency versus trusting a rigid structural limit to prevent a slow slide into dictatorship.
And who won in North Dakota?
North Dakota did ultimately ratify the amendment, but the debate was so fierce they actually had to reconsider the vote the following day before it finally passed.
It just shows that these state legislators weren't taking this lightly. They were debating the core mechanics of democracy.
Exactly.
And then you have states where the ratification was highly symbolic. Texas is a standout example in the historical record.
Texas is fascinating because of the specific date they chose to ratify.
When was it?
The Texas legislature finalized their approval on February 2010 in 1951.
Which is George Washington's birthday. That cannot be a coincidence.
Oh, it was a highly deliberate, symbolic nod to the man who originated the unwritten two-term tradition.
Wow.
And at the time, the Texas legislature was heavily controlled by Democrats, the party of FDR, yet the amendment had strong bipartisan support.
Why? What were they worried about?
The debates in Texas focused heavily on the mechanics of political corruption. One Democratic representative, Samuel Isaacs, made a compelling argument about the sheer force of federal patronage.
Patronage?
Yes. He pointed out that a president appoints federal judges, district attorneys, postmasters, and thousands of bureaucratic officials.
That's a lot of jobs.
It is. Isaacs argued that without term limits, a president could leverage this massive patronage network to essentially renominate and re-elect themselves indefinitely, creating an unbreakable political machine.
He equated that kind of entrenched bureaucratic power to a quiet dictatorship.
He did.
So driven by these fears of patronage and entrenched power, the momentum builds over 4 years. By early 1951, the amendment is closing in on the magic number of 36 states.
And the final push in February 1951 was a dramatic flurry of legislative activity. Several states realized they had the opportunity to be the deciding vote.
Everyone wants to be the one to cross the finish line.
Right. Nevada, Utah, and Minnesota all ratified the amendment within days of each other.
Oh, wow.
The Nevada process was particularly interesting. The Republican-controlled state Senate wanted to ensure the amendment wasn't viewed purely as a partisan attack on FDR's legacy.
Okay, so what did they do?
They intentionally gave a lifelong Democratic senator the privilege of officially making the motion to ratify.
That's a nice bipartisan touch.
It was. Shortly after Nevada, Utah passed it. And finally, on February 27, 1951, Minnesota voted yes, officially becoming the 36th state to cross the threshold. The 22nd Amendment was permanently codified as the law of the land.
But, and I love this, our sources reveal an incredibly quirky historical fact that occurs right after Minnesota's vote.
Yeah, it's so strange.
The race is over. The 7-year window didn't matter anymore because they had hit the 36-state requirement. The amendment was officially part of the Constitution, and yet states kept voting on it.
They really did.
Alabama, Florida, Maryland, and South Carolina all went through the time and expense of formally ratifying the 22nd Amendment after it was already constitutional law.
Yep.
From a purely practical standpoint, why on earth would a state legislature spend its time debating and voting on a law that has already passed?
I mean, it seems redundant, but it highlights the immense symbolic weight that constitutional amendments carry in the American political system.
Symbolic weight.
Yeah, state legislatures understand that they aren't just passing functional laws, they are recording their state's official philosophical stance for the historical record.
Okay, that makes sense.
Even though their votes couldn't change the legal outcome, lawmakers in places like Maryland and South Carolina demanded to be on the record.
What were they saying?
In Maryland, supporters passionately urged ratification as a moral stand against giant executive power and what they termed Caesarism.
Caesarism.
Wow.
Yeah. They wanted their state's opposition to entrenched political machines permanently etched into the National Archives. It was about making a definitive statement of principle regardless of the practical legal effect.
It is the political equivalent of signing a petition after the fundraising goal has already been reached, just to say, I was here, I witnessed this, and this is what I believe.
That's exactly it.
So the 22nd Amendment is ratified, the text is finalized. But once a law is passed, it doesn't just sit behind glass in the National Archives. It enters the judicial system.
It definitely does.
It becomes a live legal weapon used by lawyers and judges to resolve active disputes.
And its application in the courtroom has been surprisingly diverse. I mean, the 22nd Amendment hasn't just been used to govern the presidency. It has been utilized by state Supreme Courts to validate the very concept of term limits at the local and state levels.
Walk us through that logic, because if I'm a local politician running for city council or state assembly, what does an amendment about the President of the United States have to do with my local election?
Right. It sounds disconnected, but it serves as the ultimate philosophical precedent.
How so?
When local politicians try to challenge state or city term limits, they frequently argue that restricting who voters can choose violates fundamental democratic rights.
Okay.
They argue that if the voters want to elect the same mayor for 30 years, the law shouldn't stop them. But state Supreme Courts have repeatedly pointed to the 22nd Amendment to dismantle those arguments.
So they use the federal Constitution to justify local laws.
Precisely. A prime example is a California Supreme Court case called Legislature v. UU.
What happened there?
Well, California voters had passed a proposition imposing term limits on state legislators. The politicians sued, claiming it was unconstitutional.
Shocking. Politicians suing over term limits.
Right. But the California Supreme Court upheld the term limits, explicitly citing the 22nd Amendment as proof that restricting the succession of incumbents is a rational public policy.
Oh, fascinating.
The court argued that if the nation decided that term limits were necessary to protect the presidency from entrenched monopolies, well, that same logic perfectly applies to a state assembly seat.
So the judicial logic is essentially, if it is good enough to constrain the leader of the free world, it is certainly good enough to constrain a state senator.
Exactly. The courts consistently argue that term limits are not an anti-democratic suppression of the voters. Instead, they're a healthy constraint that prevents political monopolies, disrupts corrupt patronage networks, and encourages highly competitive elections.
Makes perfect sense.
We saw the exact same logic applied in Pennsylvania in a case called City Council of City of Bethlehem v. Marcinson, where the court upheld mayoral term limits using the 22nd Amendment as their philosophical anchor.
Did the United States Supreme Court ever weigh in on this underlying philosophy of term limits?
Yes, in a massive landmark case called U.S. Term Limits, Inc. v. Thornton.
What was the issue there?
The Supreme Court had to decide whether individual states could impose term limits on their federal congressional representative.
Oh, that's a big one.
Yeah. The court ultimately ruled that states cannot do that because term limits act as a fundamental qualification for office, just like the constitutional requirements for age or citizenship.
And how does the 22nd Amendment fit in?
The court used the 22nd Amendment to prove their point. Because a term limit is a fundamental qualification, it can only be imposed on federal offices through a formal constitutional amendment, exactly as they did for the presidency in 1951. A state cannot unilaterally add a new qualification for a federal office.
Okay, so the 22nd Amendment sets the foundational legal philosophy for how the American judiciary views the concept of holding office.
Yes.
But the amendment has also been used directly in modern times to resolve presidential election disputes. It acts almost like a legal shield against certain types of lawsuits.
It functions as a vital structural check on frivolous, repetitive, or politically motivated litigation.
Interesting.
We can see this mechanic clearly by examining court cases involving both Barack Obama and Donald Trump.
Let's examine those cases, relying strictly on the legal facts and judicial rulings provided in our sources. What happened in the courtroom during the Obama administration?
Throughout his presidency, Barack Obama faced numerous birther lawsuits.
Right.
These plaintiffs filed cases challenging his eligibility to hold the office, falsely claiming he was not a natural-born citizen. Now, while lower courts routinely dismissed these cases on their merits, the 22nd Amendment provided a definitive, unbreakable end to the litigation after he won his re-election in 2012.
Wait, how does the amendment stop a lawsuit about citizenship?
It utilizes a legal concept called the mootness doctrine.
Mootness doctrine.
Basically, a court will not hear a case if the outcome will have no practical effect on the real world. In a federal case called Grinnell's v. Electoral College and a similar state-level case in Vermont called Page v. State, appeals courts dismissed the eligibility challenges as completely moot.
Because he was already in his second term.
Exactly. The courts reasoned that because Obama had already been elected twice, the 22nd Amendment constitutionally barred him from ever running for president again. Because it was legally impossible for him to appear on a future presidential ballot, there was no active legal controversy for the court to resolve regarding his future eligibility.
That's brilliant.
Yeah, the 22nd Amendment rendered the entire avenue of litigation moot, permanently shutting down the plaintiff's arguments.
The court essentially said, even if we entertain your argument, he can't run again anyway, so we're not wasting judicial resources on this.
Yeah.
It is a massive structural shield.
It really is.
And how did courts apply the amendment to Donald Trump?
The application here was entirely different. It dealt with the strict definition of what constitutes an election. Very recently, in a 2025 case called Doe v. Trump, a plaintiff filed a lawsuit attempting to forcefully remove Donald Trump from office or keep him off future ballots.
Okay.
The plaintiff presented a highly unusual and creative legal argument.
What was the argument?
Well, the plaintiff pointed out that Donald Trump had repeatedly and publicly asserted that he actually won the 2020 election.
Right.
The plaintiff argued that if we take the candidate at his word, then he had effectively been elected 3 times in 2016, 2020, and 2024. Therefore, the plaintiff claimed, Trump was actively violating the 22nd Amendment's 2 election limit and must be disqualified.
Wow, that is some incredible legal gymnastics. They tried to use the candidate's own political rhetoric to trigger a constitutional term limit?
Yeah, they tried.
How did the federal court handle that?
The federal district court dismissed the lawsuit swiftly and decisively by strictly applying the textual legal reality of the 22nd Amendment. The court noted that the amendment restricts a person from being formally legally elected more than twice. The court stated that it is a matter of irrefutable official public record that Joe Biden was the officially elected president in the 2020 election, having received the majority of the Electoral College votes certified by Congress.
Right.
Therefore, in the eyes of the law, Donald Trump had only been legally elected twice. The court's ruling proves that the 22nd Amendment operates strictly on formal legal definitions of an election, and it cannot be triggered by political rhetoric, campaign statements, or a candidate's personal beliefs.
Okay, so we've seen how the courts easily swat away these straightforward interpretations. Whether it is applying a mootness doctrine or strictly defining an official election, the front door of the 22nd Amendment is heavily guarded.
Very heavily.
But here's where it gets really interesting. This brings us back to the political thriller scenario we started with. What happens if a former 2-term president tries to bypass the heavily guarded front door and get back into the Oval Office through the vice presidential back door?
Ah, yes. Now we are entering the realm of the great constitutional loophole. This is the massive, unresolved gray area that legal scholars debate fiercely.
This is the core focus of the comprehensive analysis by constitutional scholar Dan T. Conan. The central burning question is this. Can a twice-elected president, someone who is absolutely constitutionally barred from running for the presidency again, legally run for vice president?
It is a brilliant, intricate constitutional puzzle. And to even begin to solve it, we have to look beyond the 22nd Amendment and introduce another crucial piece of the Constitution, the 12th Amendment.
The 12th Amendment, okay.
Ratified way back in 1804, the 12th Amendment was designed to fix the Electoral College and revolutionize how we elect the vice president. But the most important sentence for our discussion is tacked onto the very end of it.
What does it say?
The 12th Amendment states, no person constitutionally ineligible to the office of president shall be eligible to that of vice president.
Which, on the surface, seems like an open and shut case. It seems to slam the back door shut and lock it.
It does seem that way.
Right, because if the 22nd Amendment says I cannot be elected president again, doesn't that inherently make me ineligible to the office and therefore, under the 12th Amendment, ineligible to be vice president?
That is the standard conventional assumption. It is the argument made by several prominent legal scholars who believe the system functions logically. But Dan T. Conan's textual analysis completely upends that assumption by forcing us to look incredibly closely at the precise vocabulary the framers used. He argues that we are conflating 2 very different legal concepts.
Walk us through Conan's argument. How does he separate the concept of being elected from the concept of being eligible?
So Conan points out that the rules governing who is allowed to be president are scattered across different parts of the Constitution. Article 2 sets the actual fundamental eligibility requirements for the presidency.
And what are those?
There are only 3 requirements listed. You must be a natural-born U.S. citizen, you must be at least 35 years old, and you must have been a resident of the United States for 14 years. If you meet those 3 criteria, Article 2 says you are eligible to the office. Conan points out that a former 2-term president still meets all 3 of those criteria. Winning elections doesn't make you age backwards, and it doesn't revoke your citizenship.
Okay, I follow that. Under Article 2, they still possess the fundamental human qualifications to be eligible. But what about the 22nd Amendment? Doesn't that act as a new 4th eligibility requirement?
This is where Conan argues that the specific grammar of the 22nd Amendment is everything. Read the text closely. It explicitly says no person shall be elected to the office more than twice.
Oh.
Yeah, it conspicuously does not say that a twice-elected person is ineligible to hold the office. It only bans the specific narrow act of being elected to it by the Electoral College. Conan argues that being eligible to hold the office and being eligible for election are two entirely different legal statuses.
I'm going to try to build an analogy here to see if I'm grasping the mechanical difference Conan is highlighting.
Sure.
Let's think of the presidency as an exclusive, high-end nightclub.
I like it.
The 22nd Amendment is a strict rule posted at the VIP front door, which represents getting elected president by the voters. The rule says you cannot walk through this front door more than twice. If you try a third time, the bouncer stops you. You are banned from the front door.
That perfectly represents the restriction on election.
But the 12th Amendment is the security guard checking IDs at the side door, the vice presidential entrance, and according to Article 2, the only things that security guard checks on your ID are if you are 35, a natural-born citizen, and a resident.
Right.
The side door guard does not have a clipboard tracking how many times you went through the front door.
Exactly.
So, because your ID is valid, you get inside the club through the side door. And here is the kicker. Once you are legally inside the club, if the lead singer suddenly drops the mic, meaning the current president vacates the office, the rules of succession say you are legally already inside and fully allowed to step up to the main stage.
That is a highly accurate, functional way to visualize Conan's textualist argument. The front door of election is permanently barred, but the side door of succession only checks Article 2 qualifications.
Wow.
Because the 22nd Amendment only bans the election, it leaves the succession pathway completely untouched. And Conan backs up this semantic theory with a crucial, undeniable piece of historical evidence from the actual drafting of the 22nd Amendment in 1947.
What does the historical drafting record show?
This is the smoking gun for textualist lawyers. When Congress was first debating the amendment in 1947, the earlier drafts actually included the phrase, ineligible to hold the office of president.
Wait, really?
Yes. If that specific language had passed and been ratified by the states, the loophole would be permanently undeniably closed. You couldn't hold the office, meaning you couldn't be VP, but Congress deliberately deleted that phrase.
You're kidding?
Nope. They debated the wording, and they actively chose to remove ineligible to hold and replace it with the much narrower restriction, no person shall be elected.
That is wild. They literally had the words on the paper that would have prevented a vice presidential run, and they erased them.
They did. In the world of statutory interpretation, when lawmakers actively delete a broad restriction and replace it with a narrow one, judges are required to assume they did it on purpose.
So it wasn't an accident.
Right. Courts assume Congress meant exactly what they wrote. They meant to ban the election, but they intentionally chose not to ban the underlying eligibility to hold the office.
But I mean, I have to push back on this, and I imagine there's a massive rebuttal from other constitutional scholars.
Oh, there is.
Because this feels like an incredibly dangerous technicality. It feels like a clever lawyer finding a loophole that violates the entire reason the country spent 4 years ratifying the amendment in the first place.
I hear you.
If the entire point of the 1946 midterms was to stop a president from serving more than 10 years, this loophole destroys that goal.
And you are echoing the exact arguments made by the opponents of the textualist view. There is a very strong rebuttal from prominent scholars like Bruce Ackerman, and it is a view supported by political figures who have considered this reality.
Like who?
Former President Bill Clinton actually addressed this in an interview. They argue against the loophole based on the spirit and the clear legislative intent of the law.
The spirit of the law.
Right. They argue that the obvious overwhelming intent of the 1947 Congress and the 36 state legislatures that ratified it was to prevent any single human being from occupying the presidency for too long. They refer to the mathematical ceiling we discussed earlier as the 10-year rule.
Right. The math of succession was explicitly designed so that no one could serve more than 10 years.
Exactly. Ackerman argues that the American people made a considered democratic judgment to limit executive power after the trauma of FDR's 4 terms.
It was a conscious choice.
Yes. To allow a charismatic 2-term president to run for vice president and potentially succeed to the presidency could easily result in them serving 12, 14, or even 16 years in the Oval Office.
Which is exactly what they didn't want.
Proponents of the spirit argument say that relying on a grammatical, semantic loophole to facilitate a 3rd term completely subverts the democratic will that ratified the 22nd Amendment. Bill Clinton himself stated in 2014 that attempting such a vice presidential run would undermine the spirit of the Constitution.
But, if we are looking at this objectively, isn't there a severe danger in relying on the spirit of a law?
It's a fair question.
If we just go by the vibes or the unwritten intentions of a law, aren't we ignoring the actual physical words written down on the parchment?
Yeah.
I mean, if the Congress of 1947 meant to ban them from holding the office via succession, they had the word ineligible right there in the draft. They chose to delete it. Why do we have a written constitution if judges are just going to guess at what politicians secretly meant 80 years ago?
And that is exactly how textualists like Conan defend the existence of the loophole. They argue that in a society governed by the rule of law, we are governed by the text that was officially ratified, not the unwritten, subjective intentions of the drafters.
If it says elected, it means elected.
If the text says elected, a judge must interpret it to mean exactly that and absolutely nothing more. Furthermore, Conan points to another specific section of the 22nd Amendment to prove his point. The transition clause.
You mean the grandfather clause that exempted Harry Truman?
Yes, but if you look closely at the specific vocabulary used in that transition clause, it mentions persons holding the office of president or acting as president.
Okay, so
Conan argues this proves definitively that the drafters of the 22nd Amendment fully understood the legal difference between being elected to the office and succeeding to it temporarily as an acting president.
I see.
Because they use these very distinct, separate terms in the same document, it reinforces the idea that holding the office and being elected to it are two entirely separate legal mechanisms. If you block the election pathway, you haven't necessarily blocked the holding or the acting pathway.
It is a masterful, intricate puzzle. We have taken a journey today through an amendment that most people assume is a simple one-sentence rule.
It's anything but simple.
We have seen how the 22nd Amendment was born out of the ashes of a 150-year-old unwritten tradition. George Washington stepped down, FDR chose to stay through unprecedented crises, and the country reacted by writing a new code.
A very specific code.
Right. We've seen how that code created incredibly strict 10-year mathematical boundaries for successors. We've explored how it united state legislatures in a shared, profound fear of entrenched dictatorial patronage networks.
Absolutely.
And we've seen how it has been weaponized in courtrooms to justify local term limits and shut down eligibility lawsuits.
And yet, despite all of that history, all of those state debates and all of those court rulings, the specific, deliberate word choices of the drafters choosing to restrict the act of election rather than the state of eligibility might have left a massive, world-altering backdoor wide open.
That's incredible.
It is the ultimate tension between the rigid, literal text of the law and the historical, democratic spirit in which it was written.
It leaves us with an incredible, provocative scenario to ponder. Think about our current political landscape.
Oh, boy.
Imagine if a former two-term president possessing immense popularity and influence within their party actually convinced a nominee to put them on the ticket as the vice presidential candidate tomorrow.
It would be chaos.
The lawsuits from the opposing party would be instantaneous. The case would rocket to the Supreme Court in days.
Without a doubt.
And the 9 justices would have to make a historic choice. Do they honor the exact literal words printed on the parchment? Or do they enforce the historical spirit and intent of the 1947 Congress that wrote it?
That's the million-dollar question.
Which side of that argument do you think is right? Should the vice presidential side door stay open, or did the bouncer already lock it? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the 22nd Amendment. Keep questioning the rules, keep reading the fine print, and we will see you next time.